Good afternoon and good morning, depending where you are in the world. Welcome to our live Q&A. Firstly, could somebody just say something in chat or something, or say, "Yeah, John, we can hear you." Great. Then let's start with any questions. I don't know if you're on audio or I have to just look at the screen. So let's see what happens. I'm also going to be quite bored if I sit here for an hour with nobody asking really exciting questions. So somebody must have an exciting question about PCI DSS version 4. In the meantime, then I could tell you a joke about PCI DSS. But actually, I don't really know any jokes about PCI DSS. What I thought was interesting, I don't know if you noticed, was that the compliance with remediation was removed by the PCI SSC at the end of last year, just around Christmas, and I thought that was quite an interesting stage. Okay, we've got our first question. Oh, it's a hard one as well. It's, can you explain the difference between using the customized approach and using compensating controls? And that's a really interesting question. And why is it an interesting question? Because when you looked at the first version of the RFC of PCI DSS that came out, there was no mention of compensating controls, and all there was the customized approach. So let's do a quick recap. A compensating control is when you can't meet a requirement due to a documented and legitimate business or technical reason. And you can't meet the requirement as it's written, but you meet the objective of the requirement by doing something similar. And they've been around PCI DSS since version 1, and it's not uncommon to do that. And so what happened in version 4 was sometimes compensating controls really don't give you the flexibility you might want. For example, imagine you've got a zero trust environment. And if you've got a zero trust environment, it's particularly hard to use lots of compensating controls. But then if you look at requirement 7 and 8, requirement 7 and 8, which is the one about authentication and identification, is quite hard in a zero trust environment to meet the PCI requirements. So what the customized approach says is, can you meet the security objective of the requirement because you're doing something else completely different? And the important thing with a customized approach is, number one, you can only use it if you're being assessed. So if you have an assessor, you can't use that if you're self-assessing. And secondly, it's an awful lot of work, because one of the things we struggled with when we designing the customized approach, and I actually think it's one of the best things about PCI DSS version 4, is the customized approach has got the same level of rigor as the rest of the standard. And what I mean about that is that the nice thing with PCI DSS, rather than some other security standards, is a qualified security assessor is going to do a pretty strong job of assessing your controls are in place. We wanted to keep that for the customized approach. And so what you see with a customized approach is that when an entity decides to use it, they actually have to very clearly do a risk assessment. They have to clearly test that their controls are working and show how their controls are working and how they'll continue to work. And then the QSA will come along and they'll write their own test procedures, which mirror the normal sort of test procedures that the standard has, and then test against those procedures. So it should have the same rigor. So compensating controls, still there, still the same as before. Customized approach, when you're doing something that's fundamentally different to the way PCI DSS is written, often things like zero trust or cloud environments, you're meeting the security objectives and you're having an assessor. Oh, Cornelius, you asked a great question, which is, what's the main difference between version 3 and version 4? I run a whole 1-hour course on that, so I'm not going to be able to cover masses of that in this whole 1 hour. I could, in fact, if you want, you could just vote for it, and we would run a 1 hour, a free 1 hour training course if you want. What's the difference? The main differences are with the customized approach versus compensating controls, and I guess the second main difference is that there are 64 brand new requirements in PCI DSS version 4. And that's quite a lot of new requirements, 64 new requirements. and they're designed to address the way that the payment ecosystem has changed and also the ways that criminals behave. Um, and so what I'd recommend is if you're new to looking at the difference between 3.2.1 and version 4 is to go to the PCI DSS website. There's a really, really good document called What's New in PCI DSS version 4. And I would certainly look at that document first. Um, and as I said, we'd be more than happy to run like a 1 hour refresher of the main differences. I think I ran a webinar a few months ago on that, but it's more than I can cover in this. So there. Jose, motivation for people to use the customized approach. If you're happily using the requirements as they're written at the moment, I wouldn't use the customized approach unless you're doing something different in the way that you're protecting cardholder data. The customized approach, I say, is designed for organizations doing much bigger and different ways of doing security. And the best example I have of that is something like Zero Trust. Mike, you ask a really good question, which is, and I don't know if everyone can see Mike's question, so I'll repeat it. Mike says, I use my payment provider's iframe to process payments. Very good. So the website doesn't store, process, transmit, or see cardholder data, and has very limited effect on its security. But do the new requirements to prevent skimming attacks apply to you? Yes, Mike, they do. They're in SAQA as well, which is the self-assessment questionnaire you would use. And the reason for that, I am guessing the reason for that is the PCI Security Standards Council decided that they were worried about the increasing number of attacks that there are against iframes. So there are iframe overlay attacks. There is what effectively is a man in the middle attack. And so for requirement 6.4.3, and I'm just making sure I get it on screen. For requirement 6.4.3, I can share on this, can't I? Share share a screen. Let me see if I can share a screen. So let me take this and let me drag this over here and then share that screen. And if the technology works, yep, I've got SAQA on screen then. So you can see SAQA and it says, and this is requirement 6.4.3. Let me just scroll it down. So this is the one about skimming attacks. And here you can see in red, so it says, here's the note. It says, REST-AQA requirement 6.4.3 applies to the page on the MERPsite website that apply the URL of the TSP, of the third-party service provider's payment form page to the merchant's customers. So yes, yes, it does apply. Those new anti-skimming attacks do apply to SAQA. Miriam's just asked a follow-up question, so I will answer that question straight away, which is, you keep hearing that man-in-the-middle attacks are rare. Yes, they are rare. And they're actually more, the attack we saw in the last few years was a very clever one because it effectively broke the same origin policy. It hacked the merchant's web server and then reserved the PSP's frame from the merchant's web server. So same origin policy got broken. They're rare because not that many criminals are doing them because there's so much cardholder data which you can currently get without needing to do that type of attack. But I expect to see them increase as more and more entities move to using embedded iframes and SAQA effectively, or redirects. The attackers aren't going to stop still, so they're going to be doing exactly the same thing. They're going to be trying to work out different ways of being able to attack cardholder data. So yes, man-in-the-middle attacks are rare, or attacker-in-the-middle attacks, as we call them now. The big worry about the industry is, DSS version 4, DSS version 3, how long was that out? That came out in about 2016, I think. So it had a 7-year life cycle. And therefore, if you look at DSS 4, maybe it'll be till 2026, 2027, 28, 29, something like that, when DSS 4 is revised. The attacks are going to be, the criminals are going to vary their attacks. And so we'll see a lot more attacks against iframes and redirects, because the criminals are not going to stop just because we change what we do, which we do that. Um, I've a couple of questions. Let me just stop sharing if I can remember how to do that. I need to get my mouse back over here. Share. Oh, disable screen sharing. There we go. Couple of really good questions about transparent data encryption. And the answer is PCI DSS doesn't now allow. There's a requirement in PCI DSS that stored cardholder data must be strongly encrypted, which means that data at rest. Um, it was always a really poor requirement because it was actually designed to protect against two things. I mean, the one thing it was designed to protect against was cardholder data on removable media. So someone actually losing the removable media. And the second thing was it was a defensive depth control against someone getting, say, administrator credentials and being able to take cardholder data from disk. So there was one requirement in PCI DSS version 3 that did both, which said encrypt stored cardholder data at rest. Now the requirement's been significantly reworded, and it's been very clarified that there are two problems it's trying to address. So firstly, um, it is said that you cannot use transparent data encryption. So something like BitLocker or even some of so something like BitLocker. And the reason is that once the disk is effectively decrypted, an attacker with credential will have access to the data. And the idea of strong encryption is it's supposed to effectively provide a second set of authentication requirements, i.e., you have the decryption key to be able to decrypt the data. And so, no, transparent data encryption, or TDE, is now not allowed as the primary method of protecting stored cardholder data unless it's on removable media. So something like BitLocker for a flash drive or an automatically locking flash drive is okay. But generally, if you're storing cardholder data, and honestly, I have no idea, unless you are a financial services institution, why you would be storing cardholder data now in 2023. But if you are storing cardholder data, you need to strongly encrypt it. And while we're on the subject of strong encryption, I should just probably note that people I know are still using triple DES or 3DES or TDES to encrypt cardholder data. And as far as NIST is concerned, that no longer becomes strong by the end of this year. So in addition to preparing for PCI DSS version 4, now would be a great time to start also preparing to stop using triple DES. Let me go back. I've done that one. I've done that one. I've done that. Fabio, I'll come back to your question because I actually need to check the answer. It's basically sorry, Fabio asked about Appendix A1 and what we used to call shared hosting providers and now multi-tenant. It's effectively a change of name because it could apply to things other than hosting. The important thing is that you can keep things separate between different tenants or different clients. I think is it Dacian? If I mispronounced your name, I'm really sorry. Dacian said there's a challenge in handling and capturing, transmitting the PAN on the client side, so from JavaScript apps and mobile apps. And you're absolutely right, and that's actually why those two new requirements are in PCI DSS, designed to detect JavaScript attacks. But the more and more we're building business logic and business intelligence into the client, that's where the criminals will attack. Is there going to be a guide on how to properly handle this? I don't know. I'm no longer working for MasterCard, so I'm not involved directly with the council. I do hope there will be. Certainly, this is something that Jay Scrambler's obviously an expert at. We've been spending, 12 years understanding how to protect JavaScript attacks. And now, multi-application, multi-third-party JavaScript apps in a browser. So we can certainly help you informally. Will the SSC produce some documentation? I don't know. Hope so. Jeff Bennison, good afternoon, Jeff. I hope you're well. Jeff works for an organization where you get multiple calls from breach merchants and says the majority were man in the middle. Jeff's an ex-QS, in fact, Jeff is a QSA, but used to work for a forensic investigation company. So if he says that, it's probably very true. Jason, again, good afternoon. What do service providers need to do in order to be compliant with 6.4.3? Well, the service provider, and by service provider, I'm guessing you mean a payment service provider, an entity that provides a payment page or a payment iframe to a merchant. And the answer is absolutely, you need to have some protection in there to protect against skimming attacks. Now, ideally, no payment service provider will be putting third-party JavaScript on their website. Although I guess you will have marketing departments that might try and do things like that. But ideally, number one, you wouldn't have any third-party JavaScript on your website. And so your requirement for 6.4.3 will actually be reasonably easy, that you don't have any JavaScript that can, any third-party JavaScript that can be tampered with. And the only JavaScript that you have on your website is your own first-party JavaScript. Now, I would say that you need to protect that against tampering. And JScrambler's code integrity product's an absolutely awesome way of doing that. But then you also need to be able to keep an inventory of JavaScript. Now, if you've got a mature CI/CD pipeline and as a PSP, the JavaScript on your payment page is 100% in your control, you could probably build that into your change process so that if you have changes to your own JavaScript, that is signed off and authorized, and you've worked out why that needs to happen. And in terms of detecting changes to JavaScript, I think, again, part of this depends on how you run as an organization. So if you're doing very frequent releases and you're revving your JavaScript a lot, this probably won't work. But if you're not, you can use sub-resource integrity and content security policy pretty strongly, because because my assumption is then that you're changing JavaScript not that regularly, and therefore you've got a good change control process so that you can change the CSP and SRI directives to make sure that you don't break your own website. Now, the other big question for PSPs is, how do you help your merchants become compliant with 6.4.3? Because you'll have seen in the SAQA that I just saw that the PCI DSS, in its wisdom, has put those requirements back onto the merchant. So even, Jason, if they're using your iframe or your payment forms, okay, your merchant has now got requirements that they didn't have previously. So I presume you're giving them, let's call your payment, so you've got some PSP script called my PSP script, right? .js that you give to your merchants, and that's what creates the iframe, and that's what then the iframe then calls your own JavaScript. So the question is, how do you protect the JavaScript that your merchants are loading to generate your iframe, and how do you help your merchants comply with PCI DSS 6.4.3 and 11.6.1? And the answer from a JScrambler perspective is we have tools that will allow you to do that, because we can use the code integrity to protect your JavaScript, which will defeat attacks against your JavaScript. The other way of doing it is to help your merchants use CSP and SRI, but that means you need to provide an SRI hash every time you rev your JavaScript, which will then break every single payment page and have every merchant ringing you up for support. So it's not a great approach, which is the one that was envisaged by the PCI DSS, who were, when I say envisaged by the PCI, it's one of the options that the PCI DSS says, because very clearly, because of man-in-the-middle attacks, and if you look at most merchants' websites, things hosted on WooCommerce or something like that, you see a lot of third-party JavaScript on there, and that's what the bad guys are going to be trying to attack, to try and get into, to either put a frame overlay or a man-in-the-middle attack over your payment service provider's iframe. So it's a really important thing, and I think in an ideal world, we'd have certified payment service providers where the PCI DSS had signed off, had authenticated the code, like a software security framework applicable to that, particularly for that. But while we are at the moment, I think using a product like code integrity or some sort of code obfuscation, and something that does code protection and code tamper detection, is the best way of protecting your merchants. Sorry, that was quite a long, rambling answer. I hope that was useful to you. So if you're not revving your JS very often, CSP and SRI, but when you do rev your JS, your SRI, lots of things are going to break. So the other way of doing it is to say, okay, let's make my own PSP's JavaScript tamper resistant and tamper detecting, which is something that JScrambler can help with. Right, Mike, you ask, are there any changes in version 4 that are directly related to cloud infrastructure? So I'm going to be very pedantic. No, there's nothing directly related, but indirectly, the standard was, a lot of the wording was changed to make it clear that if you were using a cloud infrastructure, it was still very possible for you to comply with the standard. So in version 3, we call them firewalls. in version 4, we call them network security controls. So it could be the network security control rather than a firewall. There is there is actually one bit in version 4 that is horrendously it's a tiny change in wording, but if you are using infrastructure as code, it's actually quite a big significant change. I'm just going to cheat because I cannot still remember all the requirement numbers, which I guess is a good thing, isn't it? And I just want to get the right requirement up so that I don't misspeak or get it wrong, as some people would say, because there's a really interesting issue if you are using infrastructure as code, which is very typical in a cloud environment. And what I mean by that is something like, you know, Terraform or something like that. So so in requirement 1.2.8, so requirement 1.2.8, let me just put that on. Let me see if I can just put that on screen. And so share, share, share screen to share. So requirement 1.2.8 talks about configuration passwords for network security controls or NSCs. Um, and this was originally when I first started, and you can tell because I have slightly grey hair when I've been around a while. When we rebooted a router on the network, it hadn't enough RAM on it to hold its own configuration, so it used to have to load it from a TFTP server. And one of the attacks was people would change the configuration files for your routers, and when they rebooted, they'd load a faulty configuration. So this requirement was really designed to make sure that that didn't happen. However, the SSC was very conscious that now a lot of infrastructure is infrastructure as code, and so this requirement 1.2.8 now applies. If you see the applicability note, made it very clear that this applies to any configuration files that build or configure infrastructure. And I think this is probably one of the biggest hidden things in version 4, that if you are very cloud first, and you're using something like Terraform to build your environments, those Terraform script files are now very much in scope of DSS. And as Jeff really handily notes in the chat, there is a PCI DSS guidance document on cloud computing. It's from about, I think, 2017, so it could probably do with a revision now. Um, but version 4 was still made so it was generic enough that you could use it in a cloud environment, or you could use it on an on-prem infrastructure environment. And I think I'm out of questions now. Oh, Felipe, you asked the question I wish no one would ever ask. It's a good question. Felipe asked this: why does the standard still insist on changing passwords every 90 days when good practice now from NIST and from the UK National Cybersecurity Centre is we shouldn't force users to change the passwords every 90 days? And the answer is, well, the answer is it's a tough one, because if you read NIST, and I think it's Special Publication 863 Part B, which is the one that talks about changing passwords, it's actually a very multi-layered approach. It says, it's not great practice to force your users to change passwords, but on the other hand, depending on the sensitivity of the data you're protecting, you should probably do something else as well as having passwords. And frankly, what PCI DSS did is it's put multi-factor authentication in place now for all access into the CDE from 2025. So that's one of so from 2025. That is one of the new PCI DSS requirements, that all access, not just administrative and remote access, but all access into the CDE is required to have multi-factor authentication. And so here is the big thing, is that if your password is the only thing that you have that's doing authentication, you still have to change it every 90 days. However, if your password is one of multiple authentication factors, i.e. you've got a token and a password, or a biometric and a password, then the password doesn't need to be changed every 90 days. So it was a sort of compromise that said, effectively, once you move to MFA, you don't need to change your password every 90 days. And that's sort of what NIST 863 Part B says for high value data, not for low value data, but for high value data. Jeff says a lot of legacy and current applications won't accept the new password guidelines. Come on, most things will accept 12 characters now. And the standard says very clearly that if you have a technical thing, like you can't do 12 characters, you can still go back down to 8 characters. And if you can't even do that, then you should use a compensating control and work on increasing the complexity of your passwords so that you can get the same complexity. Otherwise, you need MFA, I think. I mean, I think we should all realize in 2023 that having a single password to protect anything is not a great idea. And that, the effectively, MFA is effectively the way to go. Charles, I don't understand what you mean by DTE, I'm afraid. Do you mean transparent data encryption or data terminal equipment? Oh, so transparent data encryption. That's a very good question. I think the answer is no, because your single sign-on shouldn't give access to the decryption keys, because that effectively makes it transparent encryption. So I would be then looking for a compensating control or some way of being able to have a second level authentication to be able to get into the encrypted data. But I'm not an expert at call recording systems. I have a good friend who is, but that's a hard thing. So yeah, so transparent data encryption has been outlawed for everything. These have been some great questions, so thank you, everybody. Jow asks, what's the main criteria I have to prevent the QSA to prove I'm compliant? Well, if you've never undergone a QSA assessment, what happens is this: the qualified security assessor will come to you and they will, and I'll just put a bit of the PCI DSS standard on screen. The qualified security assessor, for every single requirement, has a defined approach testing procedure, which hopefully you can see on screen at the moment. And so if we're looking at requirement 1.2.7, which is configurations of network security controls are reviewed at least once every 6 months to confirm they're relevant, the standard now says exactly what the qualified security assessor will want to see. So firstly, if I look at the 1.2.7.A, they'll want to review procedures that says your organization has a procedure for doing this. Then they'll want to look back at previous reviews to see that they've happened and interview people to say how often do you do this and when do you do this. And then they'll look at the network security configurations themselves, and depending on the size of the network security configuration, they'll either go for every single rule in there, or they'll do a rule sample and say, okay, show me the business justification for that. Prove to me that is a real justification. And so a QSA assessment will go through all 248, I think it is, requirements, and they will then go through very clearly the defined testing procedure here in the standard and go through every single one. So it's going to take at least 5 days. Any other QSAs? I know, Jeff, you're on the call, but I don't think I've ever seen a full assessment go for less than 5 days in an environment. So it's quite an in-depth thing, which is why PCI DSS, despite its annoying prescriptive nature, is actually the assessment can be a rigorous assessment, as opposed to somebody going, and I'm not going to mention the other standards, but somebody just looking at your procedures and going, well, you seem to have everything documented. Okay. I'm going to go, Miriam, you asked a great question about virtual cards and PCI DSS. This is complicated, so I'm going to go pretty slowly. There are two sorts of virtual cards. Cards that can be used once, single-use virtual cards, or SUVCNs, and then multiple virtual cards. The rules are very different. Firstly, there is a PCI SSC FAQ, a frequently asked question, about virtual cards. I can't remember what it says now because it's changed a few times. I think it says ask the card brands, in which case you need to ask the card brands because it's their cards that are being protected. And the good news is that both card brands actually have a reasonable thing on their website about protecting cards. So about single-use virtual cards. But as I'm just typing a URL in while I try and speak. But if you go to mastercard.com/PCI360, which is MasterCard's everything you ever wanted to know about PCI DSS but were afraid to ask MasterCard. I've got that website up now, and we scroll down, and eventually we will get to something, hopefully. Gosh, I've not looked at this for a while, and this is where you do this live and you realize that they've actually taken the link away. No, thankfully it's still there. So there's an FAQ on the MasterCard website called Virtual Card Numbers and SDP Compliance Frequently Asked Questions. So that the URL for that is mastercard.com/PCI360 will get you to this list. Visa have also exactly the same document on their website, and I believe American Express have. And typically, let me summarize what they all say. They all typically say single-use virtual cards do not need to be protected by PCI DSS. However, you have to be 100% sure that the environment that's processing single-use virtual cards, right, it is absolutely never going to see a multiple-use virtual card or a normal card. And if you can do that, then you can exclude those card numbers from your PCI DSS scope. But I've never seen, apart from in one instance, which was a company that issued single-use virtual card numbers, I've never seen anyone being able to do that. So the answer is, technically, they're not in scope. Practically, it's almost impossible to separate them from all the cards data that are in scope. Okay, Miriam, I hope that answered your question, but the card brands is the place to go. Fabio asks, talking about risk assessment, what's your point of view about the removal of the requirement from a formal organization-wide risk assessment, which was in, I think, 12.1 in version 3, to be replaced with targeted risk analysis when the standard requires a targeted risk analysis? It's a really great question. I have to say that when you're writing standards and revising standard, it's a committee, so we achieve consensus on it. So my personal opinion might not be the same as what appeared in the standard. I always liked the risk assessment because it allowed an organization to go above and beyond PCI DSS and say, where did it think there were any risks? But it was never done particularly well. Anyone who's a QSA will tell you that people really didn't do very good risk assessments. And there was one bit of feedback that came in, and I've heard this a few times, is like, what's the point of an entity doing a risk assessment and some threat analysis when effectively the PCI SSC's done that and said, here are the controls you need to protect cardholder data? And so my view is that for most organizations, it'll make no difference because they didn't do a very good job of the risk assessment anyway. And having a targeted risk analysis where you need one will actually be a positive step forward because it's just in a few places. And people need to think, well, what's the risk of how frequently should I check my point of interaction devices for tampering? So I think overall, I think it's a positive move. I'm sad because I really like the risk assessment requirement. Partially, that's because that's how I got into PCI DSS. My first job was writing risk assessments for merchants because I was a risk assessor rather than a QSA. So I got into PCI DSS through those risk assessments. So it was one of my favorite requirements, because also it allowed you. And here's the thing: remember that PCI DSS changes more slowly often than the criminals change. So for me, when I was actually in charge of a large organization's security and security of cardholder data, the risk assessment was my opportunity to say, well, actually, for example, there have been a lot of skimming attacks. There aren't direct requirements yet in PCI DSS against skimming attacks. But having done my risk assessment, I can see this is a new threat that the standard doesn't cover. I'm going to go and buy something to protect against that. So I think if a risk assessment's done well by an organization, then it will give them some benefit, but I never thought it did. Jack asks the €800 question or €1,000,000 question, which is, do you think we'll continue to see third parties being compromised as a means to exfiltrate data? Oh, yes. Will it go behind card data in the future? Oh, yes. And we just have to look at the way that we are building applications now. We've already talked about the fact that we're building applications by compiling JavaScript in a consumer browser, and maybe even the data doesn't go back to your web service. So if you're doing e-commerce, some of your catalog might be coming from one place, your shipping options and your packaging might be coming from somewhere else. The card payments might be coming with somewhere else. And so this is an immensely complicated thing we're building in the browser. If I'm an attacker and I can attack a third party and compromise multiple merchants at the same time, then that's great. If I'm an attacker and I can compromise a library, then that's great. I mean, at JScrambler, we saw a great attack a few weeks ago where an attacker compromised an old JavaScript library that wasn't actually in use anymore. They retook over an old domain name where there was a JavaScript library being hosted, and then they tampered with that. So criminals are clever. Criminals are much cleverer than most of us, which is sad, really. And so we see quite frequently that they will attack third parties because it's an easier way in to some organizations. So absolutely, I would think third parties will continue to be being attacked quite frequently. And I would spend a lot more time looking at my third party, and especially third party JavaScript I'm putting on my website, than maybe I would have done in the past. And also, you see a lot of attacks against NPM libraries. You see attacks against Git. You see all sorts of clever third-party attacks, and I think they're going to just get cleverer. So I would keep a watch on what's happening in the world to learn about that. Philippa asks, do you see people taking action already to comply with DSS4, or at the moment only the QSA is talking about it? We're terrible in the payments industry for leaving things to the last minute, which is often why things end up actually being pushed backwards in terms of deadlines. Of the people I've talked to, big merchants are now doing impact assessments that go to PCI DSS4, but they're not yet assessing themselves against it. But a lot of companies will have their first DSS4 assessment this year. And if you're doing that, I would go early as possible to give you time to do the remediation that you will find because of the subtle changes in some of the requirements. But I think now 2024 is a year away, not 2 years away. I think a lot of people will now be looking at DSS4 properly. My New Year's resolution is to keep talking to people about DSS4. So I hope your New Year's resolution is to keep thinking about how do I get my organization ready for DSS4, or how do I get my clients ready for DSS4. So a lot of it's about education. And for people in the UK, hopefully we'll see you at PCI London next week, which is going to be a big kickoff for that educational thing. I should also note that the PCI SSC has now got their global content library live, and there's lots of really good DSS4 content there. But if you've not yet started doing DSS4, I would start off by going on an impact assessment, looking through what's changed and saying, are any of those big or small changes for us? And Jack says, these third parties attacks, John, it might not be an attack. It might just be a simple misconfiguration. Yes. I mean, lots of misconfigurations are ways in because criminals try misconfigurations, but also, yeah, you can misconfigure something yourself and end up leaking data. And that there's some very, very good. When I say good, I don't mean good, right? Good was the wrong word to use. There have been some very instructive examples in the US recently. A large number of hospitals and healthcare providers use the Meta, the Facebook pixel, on every single page of their website. And what was happening was that Facebook pixel, which tries to effectively suck up as much data as possible, it started sending healthcare data to Facebook, or to Meta. Um, and that was a misconfiguration. You could have configured, I believe you could have configured, although it was quite complicated, that meta pixel, that meta tag, to not take the information that it did. But because it did take that information, it sent protected healthcare information under the US HIPAA regulation to Meta, which was not a business entity that was governed by HIPAA. And so you saw in the States last year, a large number of healthcare providers had to actually do formal breach notification that they breached people's private health data, and they received censures from the Department of Health and Human something or other. If anyone's interested in that, send me an email, john.elliott@jscrambler.com, and I can send you some links to some of the regulatory action that was taken. But that was a complete misconfiguration with data being sent to a third party that people had not seen before. So I think we'll see a lot more of that in the next few years. Criminals I always talk about cardholder data being the canary in the coal mine. Criminals take cardholder data because they found ways of monetizing it. And so we see a clever attacks against cardholder data. As we're seeing, and especially in Europe, stolen cardholder data is less easy to monetize. And so criminals are stealing other types of data. Jeff said something very interesting in chat, which of course is when we're talking about DSS4 compliance, we should obviously encourage your third-party service providers to become version 4 compliant sooner rather than later. Not that Jeff works for a service provider at all, but he's absolutely right. Now is the time to start having those conversations. It's been a really brilliant set of questions. Thank you to everyone who's been typing questions, and I've been blown away by how in depth and specific that some of them were. While we're waiting for the next question, I thought I'd tell you one of my secrets of PCI DSS. And it's a really silly secret, but I spend a lot of time answering questions. I've been in the industry for a long time, so a lot of people just randomly send me questions going, John, do you think you could answer this? And when we were at MasterCard, we would get a lot of questions from merchants and from QSAs and things. And maybe 80% of the answers we gave were, there's already a PCI SSC FAQ, a frequently asked question about that. And so my biggest tip to everyone is when you think, oh, I wonder what about this, or I wonder about that, is to go to the PCI SSC website. And let me try and get that up. And PCI. It'd help if I could type, wouldn't it? And let's go to the PCI SSC website. Let me just share my screen again. Because I mention this to lots of people and they say, what do you mean FAQs? And it's sort of hidden, isn't it? So again, I hope you can see my screen. And if we go to where it says FAQs in the top right-hand corner next to that little dying Twitter bird and click on FAQs, and we have a whole lot of frequently asked questions. Let me see if we can do virtual cards. See if we got the answer right. Oh, gosh. Virtual. Does PCI DSS apply to virtual electronic fans? And of course, now it says, now talk to the brands. And does PCI DSS one-time or single-use pans? And then it's like contact the payment run. So they aren't particularly great examples, are they? But like, well, what's an inactive user account in regard to requirement 8? So my biggest thing is if you've not mentioned the FAQs, if you've not seen the FAQs before, then the FAQs on the PCI SSE website are an absolutely stunning place to go and get information. And you used to answer like more than half the questions we used to get at MasterCard when people ask questions about PCI SSE things. And then if we go to the other place I showed you before, MasterCard PCI 360. And again, Visa have got one of these as well. But MasterCard has a really stunningly good frequently asked questions. So I would always, when anyone asks me a question about like, can I still use this terminal? What's the MasterCard rules? I always go to the MasterCard site and look at their documents, read their FAQs. And the other thing is, MasterCard, Visa don't do this. MasterCard put out a quarterly newsletter, which you can sign up for at their website. And that gives you their view of the PCI DSS world at the time. Visa, again, and I can't remember the URL for Visa, but Visa Inc. has a similar section of its website giving lots of details about its programs and how it views some of the PCI DSS standards. Let me stop sharing. Oop. That's, the weird thing is, of course, that share, disable screen sharing. I'm told we've just got time for 2 more questions, unless I ramble on quite a lot, and then we've probably just got time for 1 more question. So I think I've answered everything that is there at the moment. Is there any one thing I haven't answered their question, or does anyone have a different question? It's not, I was going to say this is your last chance. It's not your last chance because we'll do this again some other time because I think it's been quite a useful exercise. And I can see lots of people now are typing rapidly to get their last questions in. Charles, you ask, would multi-factor authentication compensate for single sign-on? The problem is that multi-factor authentication will be a requirement anyway in version by April 2025, and so you cannot use it as a compensating control for anything because it's already a requirement. In the meantime, between now and then, you could probably use MFA as a compensating control for something like a second level of authentication to access non-encrypted data for the encrypted requirement. You could probably do that, but you're only going to get a 2-year lifespan for that. So sadly not. Jeff says, thank you very much. Thank you, Jeff, for your questions. Dacian says it's not a question, but it's sort of a question, isn't it? I have some courses on Pluralsight on PCI DSS. You're expecting an upgrade on the course. There's already a what's new there, and the basic course has now been upgraded already. I wrote that last year, and we're planning the upgrades for the rest of the courses now. But thanks for the question. That's not a question. Thanks for the non-question. Fabio, I'm going to finish with your question because it's awesome. Fabio asked a question about 8-digit bin masking when displayed and asks, have the payment card brands updated their FAQs? MasterCard has. I don't know what Visa's done, and Amex don't have 8-digit bins, so that's, do Amex have 8-digit bins? No, they don't have 8-digit bins. There's the FAQ on the PCI website for 8-digit bin truncation has been finally updated for about the 18th time, and that is pretty good now. It basically says first 8 and I have to check and say it's first 8 and any other 4, first 8 and last 4. I think it now says first 8 and any other 4. Any other 4 for truncation. The masking requirement in DSS version 4 says, and I have to be really careful about this, because it says for people who do not have a legitimate business interest to see the pan, right? And lots and lots of people just get this wrong and they say you have to mask all pans on screen. It does not say that. It says people who do not have a legitimate business. And I've seen people with a legitimate business reason who are still looking at masked pans, and it frustrates them no end. So, number one, argue with your QSA. If someone's got a legitimate business reason, they can see the whole pan, period. If they don't have a legitimate business reason, then the standard currently says something really stupid, which says it's bin plus last 4, which means that you need to have bin tables to be able to know what the bin is. MasterCard have said, treat all MasterCards as if they're 8-digit bins. I don't know what Visa have said. Amex, they're all 6-digit bins anyway. But let's say I actually haven't looked at the Visa website for a while. So I'm sorry for that one. But go to the Visa website to check. Fabio, I hope that was vaguely useful. And I would also expect, I would also expect version 4.01 or version 4.1 of the standard to come out that will clarify that, because it's daft currently requiring you to have bin tables to know what to mask. Well, we're pretty close to the top of the hour, and my colleagues tell me it's time we should wrap up. So I'd like to thank you firstly for Dacian, just tell your QSA that they're being stupid. Someone typing, there's no requirement in DSS to do that. So the QSA is going above and beyond their thing. Email me if you want to talk more about that. So I want to thank everyone for turning up and for asking such great questions. I think we'll do this again a bit later, because it's quite fun to be able to have questions answered. You can contact Jay Scrambler if you want to talk about our web page integrity and our code integrity to meet the new requirements in PCI DSS version 4, or even just to chat about application security and JavaScript, because we're pretty cool at that stuff. On our website, you can see a demo of our products, and there's some good blog posts about PCI DSS and about web page integrity and code integrity. And you will see us at the 2 PCI community meetings this year. I'm not quite announcing, but we've just become principal participating organizations at the PCI SSC, which means we're going to be more tightly involved with helping the PCI SSC develop the standard. And you can find us at JScrambler or on LinkedIn, or you can mail us. There's an info at JScrambler, and I'm john.elliott@jscrambler.com. So again, thank you very much for your time. It is Friday, isn't it? So have a brilliant weekend. I hope you have a great one, and see you again either through this medium or at one of the 2 PCI community meetings or Black Hat or RSA conference that we're at this year. Thanks. Bye now.